Clint Eastwood, 4 Oscars, more than 6 decades of unshakable discipline. A living legend who has redefined the meaning of strength, control, and silence in Hollywood. From the cold gaze of the nameless man stepping out of the barren land of Western films to the uncompromising toughness of Dirty Harry, he has conquered the brightest stages on the planet with absolute precision, emotional restraint, and a will that never accepts weakness. Without needing long speeches, without needing showy displays, Clint Eastwood built an entire empire just with his look and his presence. Millions admire him as a symbol of classic masculinity, of unshakable resolve, of a man who always stands firm before every change without revealing any crack. But behind that untouchable image is a story that is not glamorous but quietly heavy, a childhood that passed in constant moving, with no place that truly belonged to him, no memories strong enough to become a foundation. A boy who was not standout, not noticed, not expected, growing up with the feeling that he could disappear without anyone realizing. A life that started with no one believing he would become anything significant. The years stepping into Hollywood with doors continuously closing, with rejections repeating until they became familiar. One night on the cold ocean, when the plane fell into the water and he had to swim by himself in the darkness, facing the possibility of disappearing without leaving a trace, with no one witnessing, no one remembering. Relationships that came and went, not loud but leaving long gaps. A family formed through many pieces but never truly connected, and behind it all, a silence stretching through many decades, where every emotion, every wound, every thought was kept inside, not shared, not explained, not needing to be understood. Clint Eastwood never told his story in the way others expected. He did not talk about what he had lost, did not recall what had gone wrong, did not seek sympathy from anyone, and perhaps precisely because of that, the world believed that behind that silence there was nothing. But what if that very silence was where everything was contained? And now, at the age of 95, when his steps slow down and time is no longer a distant concept, when the days ahead no longer stretch endlessly, what is really existing behind the man that the whole world thinks they have understood, in the shadows of fame and the memories that have never left him? Before we step deeper into the things that Clint Eastwood has never spoken about, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to acknowledge the man who has silently endured throughout his entire life. And if you want to explore what is truly hidden behind that emotionless shell, stay until the end, because the story behind it is even heavier than what you have just heard. It would be easy if Clint Eastwood's story began with a childhood full of clear upheavals, a wound that could be named, a memory painful enough for people to understand why he became the person he is. But what makes his past quietly heavy lies in the fact that it had no moment big enough to be remembered, no tragedy clear enough to be told, only a chain of days passing in temporariness, stretching and repeating until it became normal. He was born in a time when America was still struggling after the Great Depression, when every family was trying to survive rather than dream, and his family was no exception. His father took many different jobs, unstable, forcing the whole family to move constantly from one place to another, from this small town to another city, carrying very little luggage, but always carrying a feeling of never stopping. Each move was a new beginning, a new school, unfamiliar faces, classes he did not have time to adapt to before having to leave, making any connection fragile. There was no place that stayed long enough to become home, no memory deep enough to become a foundation, and no one stayed long enough to call him a close friend. In class, he was not the standout student, not the best, nor the most troublesome, but just a name easily forgotten in the long list of children trying to find their place. Teachers did not remember him. Friends did not seek him out, and he did not try to change that. There were children noticed for their talent, children noticed for their rebellion, but Clint Eastwood did not belong to any group. He existed in a blurry in-between, where there were no expectations but also no encouragement, where every day passed the same, quietly and without leaving a trace. And that very silence, not a choice, gradually became the only way he knew to exist. When growing up in an environment where no one really saw him, a person learns not to need to be seen anymore. He did not seek attention, did not try to impress, did not speak more than necessary, because he had gotten used to the fact that his words did not change anything. His independence did not come from being taught to be strong, but from there being no one there to rely on. When there was no place that was truly home, he learned not to attach too deeply to any place. When no one stayed long enough, he learned not to place too much trust in the presence of others. And when no one asked how he was feeling, he learned not to answer that question, even to himself. There are childhoods shaped by big shocks, events that change everything in just one moment. But Clint Eastwood's childhood was different. It did not break, but wore down gradually, little by little, through days with nothing special, but also nothing to hold on to, a kind of prolonged emptiness, not painful enough to cry for help, but deep enough to stay forever. And precisely from that gap, a person began to form, not from what was given, but from what was never had. While other children learn to rely on family, on friends, on relationships around them, Clint Eastwood learned to rely on himself, not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. That was how a boy grew up without leaving many marks in the memories of others, but carrying something no one saw. A silence not from lacking things to say, but from having gotten used to no one listening. And, perhaps from those years, from the school hallways where no one remembered his name, from the temporary houses he left before he could call them home, something had begun to form, slowly but surely, not confidence, not ambition, but a habit of living that later the whole world would mistakenly see as strength, the habit of not needing anyone, not needing to be understood, and never revealing what was happening inside. And then there was one night, long before the name Clint Eastwood appeared on screen, before anyone knew that face or that cold gaze, his life nearly ended in a way so quiet that if it happened, there would not be a single news line, not a single mention, no one remembering that he had once existed. It was not a dramatic moment in front of a crowd, not an accident that was recorded, but an event that happened in silence between the night and the cold ocean, where there was no audience, no witness, no one there to see a man fighting for his life second by second. That year, while still serving in the military, he boarded what seemed like a normal flight, a short journey carrying no sign of danger. No one thought that in just a few minutes everything would change. When the plane had an accident and plunged into the sea, there was no time to prepare, no chance to think, only survival instinct, and a cold truth hitting. He was in the middle of the ocean, in the darkness, and there was no one there to save him. The cold water cut into his skin, the night wind blew like knives, and the space around was just an endless stretch of black. He was not a hero in that moment. There was no dialogue, no music, no spotlight. Only a body trying to stay afloat, a gasping breath, and a fleeting but terrifyingly clear thought. If I disappear here, no one will know. No one waiting, no one searching, no one asking questions. Life could end in silence, just like the way it had begun, without leaving a trace, without leaving a story. In the freezing water, he began to swim, not because he believed he would survive, but simply because there was no other choice. Each stroke was an effort against the fatigue pulling in, each breath a struggle with the fear rising from inside. There was no clear destination, no guiding light, only instinct and a will that did not allow the body to stop. Time in that moment no longer had meaning. No minutes, no hours, only the prolonged feeling of endurance. The cold was not only outside, it gradually seeped inside, slowing every movement, making everything heavier, more difficult. There were moments when the body wanted to give up, when the thought of stopping became more comfortable than continuing, when the silence of the ocean seemed to invite him to surrender. But there was something, not clear hope, not strong belief, but only a deep reflex in the man he was, that did not allow that to happen. He continued swimming, not because he was sure he would live, but because he was not ready to disappear. When he finally reached the shore, it was not a victory in the way people usually tell. There was no one there to applaud, no one witnessing the journey that had just happened, no one saying he had done something extraordinary. Only a man soaked, freezing, exhausted, standing on land with a new truth that no one else but him knew. He had nearly died, and the world had no idea. That experience did not turn him into a different person overnight. There was no sudden awakening, no promise to change his life, but it left a quiet mark, an awareness he carried for the rest of his life, that his existence was not guaranteed, that life could end at any time without needing a big reason, without needing an explanation, and more importantly, that if he wanted to be seen, if he wanted to leave something behind, he would have to do it himself, because no one else would do it for him. From that moment, something began to change, not on the outside, but in the way he looked at the world. He no longer waited for recognition. He no longer expected opportunities to come to him. He no longer believed that if he was patient enough, everything would sort itself out. He began to understand that if life could end in silence, then the only way to fight against that was to keep moving forward, whether anyone saw it or not. And perhaps that is exactly why, later when the world saw a cold, resolute Clint Eastwood who never showed emotion, they thought that was innate strength, but they did not know that, long before the stage lights shone on him, before any role was remembered, there had been one night where he learned that silence could swallow a man. And if he did not swim through it himself, no one would do it for him. Clint Eastwood, after the night when the ocean nearly swallowed him without leaving a trace, did not return to a different world, with no guiding light or opportunities opening up right away, but only returned to a reality that was still as cold as before, where everything had to start from zero. He stepped into Hollywood, not with fame, without anyone backing him, without attention, only with a vague decision that he would try, even though no one really believed it would lead anywhere. The first years were not a journey of moving forward, but a series of stops, being blocked, being pushed back without any clear explanation. In the auditions, he was not the one who impressed. His face was commented on as too cold, too hard, lacking expression. His voice was considered monotonous, lacking appeal. His acting was judged as dry, not flexible enough for the roles Hollywood was looking for at that time. There were rooms where he stepped in with small hope and stepped out without receiving any feedback. No clear rejection, no advice, only the familiar silence he had known since he was a child. There were times when people did not even need to say anything, just a look, an indifferent nod, and he understood that he did not belong there. The first rows, if they could be called roles, were only parts, so small that they could be forgotten right after appearing. There was no opportunity to show himself, no time to prove, only short moments in projects that themselves were not remembered. He was not seen as the first choice, nor the second choice, but usually the last option, if at all. And when those projects ended, he returned to the starting point, with no clear progress, no sign that everything was changing. To survive in those years, he did whatever he could, small jobs, unstable, unrelated to the dream he was trying to pursue. Days passed between work shifts, between unsuccessful auditions, between waits without any response. Money was not enough to create a feeling of security, only enough to continue for a short additional time. There was no guarantee that next week would be better. No long-term plan, only the present stretching and repeating. There were moments when leaving seemed like the most reasonable choice, when every sign pointed out that he did not fit, when no one said he could do it, when all he received was rejection repeating until it became a habit. But what made him different was not that he did not feel disappointment, but that he did not let that disappointment become the reason to stop. He did not protest, did not try to change himself to fit what others wanted to see, and did not try to prove he was right. He just continued to stay. His persistence was not a strong statement, not a determination spoken out loud, but a repeated action. Simple and almost invisible, he continued to go to auditions, continued to take small roles if there were any, continued to do the necessary jobs to maintain life, continued to appear in places where he knew he might be rejected. There was no clear sign that everything would change, no moment showing he was getting closer to success. Only time passing, and he was still there. In an industry where everything happened quickly, where new faces appeared and disappeared in a short period of time, staying long-term was sometimes not a sign of success, but a sign of not having given up yet. Clint Eastwood was not the one chosen from the beginning, not the one Hollywood was waiting for. He was the one who stayed when many others had quit. The one who continued to step into rooms where he knew the chance was very small. The one who accepted the silence instead of seeking confirmation. And perhaps the most notable thing was not the number of times he was rejected, but the way he reacted to them. He did not turn the rejections into stories, did not recount them as wounds, did not use them to explain his path. They simply existed as a part of the process, as something unavoidable. Just like his childhood that did not leave clear marks. Just like the night on the ocean with no witnesses, his years of rejection also passed without anyone recording, without anyone seeing, except himself. And precisely in that period, something gradually formed. Not a talent suddenly appearing, nor a surprise opportunity arriving, but a persistence that was almost impossible to see. A habit that did not depend on results. Not controlled by recognition, not needing anyone to confirm he was going in the right direction. He did not know when everything would change, or whether it would change at all. But he knew one simple thing, that if he left, the story would end right there. And so he stayed, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he was not ready to disappear. And then when every door seemed to have closed in the place he once believed was the center of the dream, opportunity came from a place that no one really considered the path to success. Not Hollywood, not the big American film studios, but across the ocean in Europe, where Clint Eastwood's name meant almost nothing. It was not a prestigious invitation, not an opportunity that other actors competed for, but only a choice that many at that time were ready to refuse. But for him, someone who had gotten used to having no choices, it was the only door still open, and he stepped through it without knowing what was waiting ahead. When he met Sergio Leone, everything was not like what he had known. There were no familiar Hollywood rules, no working methods he had tried to adapt to for many years. Different language, different culture, different way of telling stories. But that very unfamiliarity became something he had never had, a space where he was not bound by old judgments. Leone did not see in him the weaknesses that Hollywood had once pointed out. He saw something else, a silence that others considered a limitation, but could become strength. In those Western films, Clint Eastwood did not need to speak much. He did not need to express emotions in the way people expected. He only needed to stand there, look, and let the silence speak for him. The silences that before had caused him to be judged as lacking energy now became what made audiences unable to look away. The cold gaze, the slow movements, the way he kept distance from everything around, all the things he had once been rejected for, now became his identity. It was not that he changed to fit the role, but the role itself was built around the person he was. Success came faster than anything he had experienced before. The films were well received, not only in Europe but spreading to many other places. The name Clint Eastwood began to be mentioned, no longer as an actor forgotten in auditions, but as a face tied to a new image. A type of hero who did not need words, did not need explanation. But what was notable was not the speed of success, but where it came from. It did not happen in his homeland. not in the place where he had spent many years trying to be recognized. It came from a foreign place where he had no past, no history, no connections at all. That created a feeling hard to name. He had achieved what he pursued, but not in the way he imagined. He became a star, but did not fully belong to the place that had created him. When he returned to America, he did not come back as a clear winner, but as someone carrying success from somewhere else, someone Hollywood began to notice, but not because they had believed in him from the beginning. There was a distance that still existed, not between him and the audience, but between him and the industry itself, that he had tried to step into from the early days. That strangeness did not disappear when he became more famous. On the contrary, it became a part of who he was. He did not fully integrate, did not become part of the familiar circles, did not join what other stars considered normal. He kept distance, just like the way he had done since he was a boy who did not belong anywhere. And perhaps that was exactly why his image on screen also reflected that. A man standing alone, not needing anyone, not explaining, not seeking sympathy. His acting style was not built from complex techniques or constant transformations, but from removing what was not necessary. Few words, few expressions, but every look, every silence carried weight. He did not try to make audiences understand him, but let them feel it themselves. And in a film world often full of clear dialogues and emotions, that silence became the most standout thing. But behind that image, the feeling of strangeness was still there. Success did not erase the years of rejection, did not change the way he viewed the world, did not make him feel he truly belonged. He had found his place on screen, but in real life he still kept a certain distance from everything around him, not because he could not get close, but because he had never really gotten used to belonging anywhere. And perhaps that was the biggest paradox in this period of his life. He achieved the recognition he once did not have, but in a way that made him even more separate. He became a symbol, but still kept a part of himself untouched. A man that the world began to see more clearly, but he himself never fully stepped out of the silence that had followed him from the early days. Clint Eastwood. The successes that came from across the ocean not only changed his career, but also brought him into a position that before had seemed like it would never belong to him. The image of the man with the cold gaze, the dusty poncho, and the gun always ready had become a global symbol. A face that audiences in many different countries recognized immediately, whether they fully understood the story or not. The Western films not only brought fame, but also created an image so powerful that it almost swallowed the real person behind it. From an actor rejected in auditions, he became the standard for a new type of character, a type of masculinity that did not need explanation, did not need to perform. Just existing was enough to create weight. But at the same time, a distance began to form, not between him and the audience, but between him and the world he had just stepped into. Hollywood, where he had once tried to join in vain, now began to open its doors, but not in a welcoming way, but more like a cautious acceptance. He did not come from the familiar system, did not grow up in relationships that had been built beforehand, did not share the same journey with those around him. His success came from a different path, and that made him always stand in a slightly off position, not completely belonging to the center. He did not join big parties, did not appear frequently before the media, did not try to build an image beyond what was necessary, while other stars gradually became part of the entertainment machine, learning how to appear, how to talk, how to build relationships. Clint Eastwood chose to keep distance, not because he could not fit in, but because he did not feel it was necessary to do so. He came to the work to work, not to become part of a circle he had never felt he belonged to. His life, even when he had become famous, still kept a discreet rhythm. There were no loud stories, no personal shares made public, no private moments exposed to attract attention. He did not try to explain himself to the world, nor did he seek sympathy from them. This made him become a figure both familiar and distant. Someone everyone knew, but no one really understood. The relationships around him also reflected that. There were not many close friends, no group of people who always appeared with him at every event. Connections, if any, were usually short-term, more tied to work than to personal life. He was not someone who opened up easily, not someone who sought closeness, and when there was no habit of sharing, the distance between him and those around him gradually became the normal state. Success continued to come, step by step, role by role, project by project, and along with it was the reinforcement of the image the world had become familiar with. But each step forward in his career seemed to also pull along a step back in personal connection. When his name was mentioned more, his life became quieter. When the lights shone on him brighter, the rest of the world around him grew darker, not because he was being separated, but because he chose to keep distance as a way to maintain the control he had always valued. The silence, which had begun from his childhood years, now was no longer just a reaction to the surrounding environment, but became a protective shell. In an industry where everything could be exploited, where every word could be interpreted in many different ways, saying nothing was sometimes the only way to keep something for himself. Clint Eastwood did not explain, did not respond, did not try to correct what others thought about him. He let the image exist on its own, without adding to it, without taking away from it. But that shell, although effective in protecting, also came with a price. When not sharing, others could not understand. When not opening up, no one could get close. And when that stretched over many years, many decades, it was no longer a temporary choice, but became the only way of living. He not only kept distance from the media, but gradually from those around him as well. Not because he did not need them, but because he had gotten used to not having them. There was a quiet paradox in this period of his life. He became one of the most recognizable faces in the world, but also one of the least understood people. Everyone knew what he looked like, knew how he acted, knew the roles that had made his name, but few knew what he really thought, what he felt, or what had made him keep going through the years. And perhaps precisely that absence, that not belonging anywhere even while standing at the center of everything, had created a feeling of loneliness that did not need to be named. It did not come from a specific event, was not tied to a clear loss, but was the result of a long process where success and distance existed together, side by side and inseparable. Clint Eastwood did not stop, did not slow down, did not change his path, but each step he took forward seemed also to be a step farther from what could be called connection. And over time, that was no longer a small part in his life, but became the foundation for the way he existed. A man standing in the middle of a crowd, but not really in it. A symbol seen by millions, but living in a space that very few could touch. A person who had learned to turn silence into strength, even when its price was having to carry everything alone. And then, when the image of that silent man had become familiar to the public, Clint Eastwood stepped into a role that not only changed his career, but also changed the way the world viewed him forever. Dirty Harry was not simply a character, not just a role in an action movie, but a symbol carrying the weight of power, of judgment, of a type of justice that needed no explanation. In the role of the tough inspector with the gun always ready, he did not just act. He became the embodiment of something that society both feared and was drawn to. And in a short time, the name Clint Eastwood was no longer tied to distant Western lands, but became the center of a much wider debate. His fame skyrocketed, faster and stronger than any period before. Dirty Harry put him in a position with no more doubt, a top star, a face where every decision carried weight. But along with that recognition was something he could not control, the way others interpreted what he portrayed. The character he built, with its coldness and decisiveness, was seen by many as a glorification of violence, as an affirmation that justice could be carried out by any means. Praise quickly came with harsh criticism, from critics to the public, from articles to endless debates. He did not just play a role. He was placed in the position of having to represent it. What Dirty Harry said, what Dirty Harry did, seemed to be attached directly to the person Clint Eastwood in real life. The separation between the character and the actor became blurred in the eyes of many, and he began to realize that there were things that once released to the world no longer belonged to him. The questions no longer revolved around the movie, but around him. What did he think about violence? Which side was he on? Did he believe in what his character expressed or not? But Clint Eastwood was not someone who liked to explain. He did not step out to defend his image, did not try to adjust the way others saw him. The silence he had built from the years before remained intact, even when the pressure around him grew larger. In a world where people constantly spoke up to define themselves, his saying nothing became a gap that others were ready to fill with their own assumptions. And gradually, he was not just an actor, but became a divisive symbol. A person where everyone looking at him saw something different. The pressure from fame did not come from the volume of work or the packed schedule, but from no longer being able to control the way he was perceived. Each next role, each decision, each step was placed under a new lens where everything could be interpreted in many different directions. He no longer just did his job, but had to exist in a space where every action could become a statement. And for a person who had gotten used to keeping everything to himself, that was a form of pressure with no way to completely avoid. The feeling of being misunderstood was not a moment, but a prolonged state. He knew that what others thought about him did not fully reflect who he really was, but he also did nothing to change that. Not because he did not care, but because he did not believe that explaining would really change the way people saw him. And when that repeated long enough, when outside judgments became stronger, the distance between him and the rest of the world became even clearer. He did not leave the work, did not step back from the lights, but also did not move closer to what was around him. He continued making films, continued acting, continued walking on the path he had chosen, but always kept a certain distance, as if there was a boundary he did not allow anyone to cross. The isolation did not come from being pushed out, but from keeping himself in his own position, where he could control what belonged to him, even if that meant having to stand alone. Dirty Harry brought power, but that power was not something that brought peace. It amplified everything, from attention to criticism, from admiration to doubt. And through all of that, Clint Eastwood still kept the way he had existed before, not explaining, not reacting, not changing to fit what others expected. But the price of that steadfastness was not small. It was the gradual separation, standing in the middle of a world, talking about him without really participating in that dialogue. The feeling that even though he was seen more than ever, he was understood less than ever. And over time, that was no longer a part of the story, but became a part of who he was. A man who could hold power in his hands, who could influence the way millions viewed justice and strength, but could not control the way the world understood him. A person standing at the center of attention, but still keeping a space for himself that no one could step into. Not because he did not allow it, but because he had gotten used to no one really being there long before fame came to him. But if power and fame had created distance between Clint Eastwood and the outside world, then his personal relationships were where that distance became clearer and more painful than ever. Not because he had no love, but because love in his life had never been a stable place to stay. Right from his first marriage to Maggie Johnson, everything did not happen in the way people usually imagine a connected family. On the surface, it was a marriage that lasted many years, long enough to be seen as lasting, but inside it was growing gaps, unresolved differences, and choices that gradually pulled the two apart. As his fame increased, his life changed. The pace of work became denser. New opportunities appeared, and along with that other relationships began to creep in. Not always clear, but enough to shake the foundation that had never been solid. The breakdown of that marriage did not happen in a single moment, but stretched out quietly, similar to the way many things in his life unfolded. There was no clear ending point, only a process in which two people gradually realized they were no longer going in the same direction. And when it ended, it did not bring complete relief, but left gaps that were hard to fill, things that were not spoken, emotions that had no place to be put down. After that came the relationship with Sandra Locke, a relationship that began like a deep connection, but ended in prolonged disputes and wounds. For many years, they were bonded not only in life, but also in work, sharing the same space, the same rhythm of life, as if they had found a balance that he had never had before. But that very closeness also carried tensions that were not always resolved. The differences, the decisions, the things that were not agreed upon gradually accumulated until there was no way to continue as before. When that relationship ended, it did not stop at the breakup. It brought along legal disputes, arguments, stories, brought to the public in a way he had never wanted. What had once been private became a topic of discussion. What had once been kept secret was now exposed under the light he had always avoided. And through all of that, Clint Eastwood still kept his familiar way of reacting: silence, not explaining much, not joining the debates he knew would have no end. But that silence did not make everything disappear. It only left the wounds there, unresolved, unnamed. Not just one or two relationships, but over time, his romantic life became a series of connections that did not last, overlapping relationships that came and went without leaving a clear structure. There were people who came when he was at his peak, people who stayed when everything became quieter, but very few really stayed long enough to create stability. Not because he lacked the ability to bond, but because his life was always moving, always changing, and perhaps deep inside he had never really learned how to stay with something for too long. Love, for many people, is a place to stop, to find balance between the outside world and the inside world. But for Clint Eastwood, it always seemed to be part of motion, not a stopping point. His relationships rarely began in stability and rarely ended in completeness. They existed in the space between, where emotions could be strong but not lasting, where connection could be deep but not enduring. And each time a relationship ended, it was not only the loss of one person, but also the accumulation of unresolved things from before. Those wounds did not appear clearly like major events in his career, were not talked about as much as the roles or awards, but they existed quietly. In the same way that most of his life unfolded, there was no moment when he stopped to look back at everything, no admission of how those things had affected him. But when looking at the entire journey, a repeating pattern could be seen: a difficulty in maintaining stability, a distance that always existed even when he was close to others. And perhaps the most notable thing was not the number of relationships that had passed, but the feeling left after it all. Not resentment, not spoken regret, but a familiar form of silence, where what had happened was not explained, not fixed, only carried as a part of life. Clint Eastwood did not stop to find answers for those things. He continued forward, continued working, continued keeping the distance he was familiar with. But each relationship that passed, each incomplete ending, seemed to leave a mark, not clear enough to be seen immediately, but deep enough to stay for a long time. And over time, those marks did not disappear. They became a part of who he was, a part of the way he viewed the world, a part of the reason why he chose to keep silent instead of opening up. Because when what was shared did not lead to lasting connection, when what was built did not hold its shape, keeping everything to himself sometimes became the more understandable choice. Not a choice that brought happiness, but a choice he knew how to live with. The relationships that came and went not only left marks in Clint Eastwood's romantic life, but also gradually formed a more complex reality, where family was no longer a simple concept, not a unified home, but many pieces existing side by side, sometimes intersecting, sometimes separating, but rarely truly becoming one. Over time, he had many children with different women, each relationship carrying its own story, its own circumstances, and its own distance. There was no common starting point, nor a center for all to return to, only connecting threads that existed but were not always connected to each other. From the outside, that could be seen as a large family, a man with many children, many generations, a legacy being continued. But from the inside, everything was not that simple. The children grew up in different circumstances, in different places, with different levels of their father's presence. There were periods when he was close, periods when he was absent, not because he completely left, but because of work, because of life, because of choices he had made earlier, making him unable to be there in the way a father is usually expected. That absence was not always spoken, not always becoming clear. Conflict, but it existed, like a gap that each person had to fill in their own way. When a father is not always present, the children learn to adapt, learn to grow up without constant guidance, learn to understand that his presence is not something predictable. And over time, that created a distance not easy to narrow, even when everyone recognized it. Clint Eastwood was not completely detached from his children. There were moments when he was there, times when he tried to connect, efforts to maintain the relationship, but those efforts were not always enough to make up for the time that had passed, the periods when his presence was incomplete. And as time went by, as each person had grown up with their own life, going back and rebuilding what had been missing was not something that could be done easily. Family, for many people, is a place where everything can return, where no matter what happens, there is still a basic connection. But in his case, family did not have that shape. It was not a unified block, but many parts existing in parallel, connected to him in different ways, but not necessarily connected to each other. That did not mean there was no affection, no care, but only that the bond was not built in the way people usually think. There were times when, looking back, he realized that there were things that had passed and could not be taken back. Not the big moments, not the memorable events, but the small periods of time, the times of not being there, the opportunities for closeness that had not happened. Those things did not make noise when they were lost, did not cause an immediate change, but when they accumulated long enough, they became a part of reality that could not be reversed. He was not someone who often talked about these things. There were no clear admissions, no stories told with regret. But the silence did not mean there was no awareness. There was a quiet understanding of what had happened, of what had not happened, and that some things, once past, could never return in the same way. The relationship with his children, therefore, was not a simple story of closeness or distance, but a collection of many different states, changing over time, over circumstances, over the way each person chose to continue. Some were closer, some were farther, some connections were maintained, some faded, and through all of that, Clint Eastwood still kept his familiar approach, not trying to control everything completely, not forcing things into a certain shape, but accepting reality as it existed. But that acceptance did not erase the feeling that there were things that had been missed, not a spoken regret, not a desire to change the past, but a quiet awareness that time does not go back, that gaps are not always fillable, and that there are parts of life that, no matter how hard one tries, will always keep the shape they have taken. And like many other aspects in his life, that did not make him stop, did not make him change the path he had chosen. He continued moving forward, continued working, continued living in the way he was used to. But somewhere behind it all, there still existed a part that no one saw. A part formed from what had not happened, from what had passed and could not be kept. And that might not be the story people tell when talking about Clint Eastwood. But it is a part of who he is, quiet but inseparable. But if the gaps in the family became clearer over time, Clint Eastwood did not stop to fill them in the way many people still do. He did not withdraw to repair them, nor did he temporarily step away from the path he had chosen to seek a different balance, but continued moving forward, faster, more steadily, as if motion was the only way to keep everything from collapsing. Work, which had already been a large part of his life, now was no longer just a career, but became a structure, a system in which everything could be controlled, in a world where emotions could change, where people could leave, where relationships could break without warning. Work was the only thing that operated according to rules he understood clearly, where he knew what would happen if he did it right, where results could be shaped by effort and discipline. He worked not in phases, with no long breaks to look back, no moments of pause to reflect, but continuously, one project following another, one role following another. And then the films where he stood behind the camera, controlling everything from beginning to end. Decade after decade, he was still there, still appearing, still creating, as if time did not have the same impact on him as on others, while many chose to slow down, to rest, to step away from the lights. Clint Eastwood did the opposite, continuing to work at a pace that others found hard to understand, not because he needed to prove anything, but because he seemed not to know how to live any other way. Work became the place where he did not need to explain who he was. On the film set, everything was clearer. Each person had their role. Each decision had its reason. Each result was the consequence of choices that had been made. There were no ambiguities like in personal life, no emotions that could not be named, no questions without answers. When he stood behind the camera, he did not have to face what had been lost, did not have to think about things that could not be changed, but only needed to focus on what was happening in front of him. And perhaps that was exactly why work was not only the place where he created films, but also the place where he avoided facing the rest of his life. Not a clear escape, not a consciously made decision, but a tendency that formed over time, where he gradually devoted more energy to what he could control and less to what he could not. When things became complicated in his personal life, he returned to work. When relationships were no longer as before, he continued working. When there were things that could not be explained, he did not try to find answers, but continued moving forward. Success, therefore, did not stop. He not only maintained his position, but expanded it, from an actor to a recognized director, from a face on screen to the one shaping the story behind it. The films he made were not only watched, but also highly regarded, awarded, and mentioned as important milestones. But each step forward in his career seemed to also pull him one step farther from other parts of his life. When he spent more time on the film set, he had less time for relationships. When he focused on perfecting a project, other things gradually moved to the background. That distance was not a declared decision, but the result of repeated choices, little by little, over many years. There was no moment when he said that work was the only priority, but when looking back, it could be seen clearly that it had become the center of everything. Not because he did not care about other things, but because work was the only place where he always felt certain. There are people who work to achieve something, to reach a specific point, and then stop when they have reached their goal. But Clint Eastwood did not stop when he had everything others considered enough. There was no clear ending point in the way he worked, no moment when he said he had completed it. He continued, not because he needed more fame, not because he needed more recognition, but because that was the only way he knew to exist. And over time, that became an inseparable part of who he was. Work was no longer a part of life, but the main structure that kept everything standing firm. When other parts became unstable, work was still there, unchanged, not leaving. It did not replace what had been lost, did not repair the gaps, but it brought a feeling he could rely on. A feeling that at least one thing in his life was still within his control. And perhaps that was exactly why he did not know how to stop. Not because he could not, but because stopping meant having to face the things he had avoided for a long time. When work slowed down, when there were no more projects to focus on, When there were no more decisions to make, silences would appear, and in those silences, what had been kept inside could become clearer. Clint Eastwood did not run from that in an obvious way. He did not suddenly change his life, but he continued working, as if continuous motion was the only way to keep everything in its right place. And his work continued to fill each day, each year, each decade in Clint Eastwood's life. What was left behind did not disappear. It only gradually became farther, fainter, but never truly left him. The relationships that once existed, once meant something, once brought a feeling of closeness over time began to change. Not because of a single event, but because of the growing distance between people who were no longer moving at the same pace. There were people who had once been very close, who had shared important periods, but then gradually no longer appeared, not because of a clear decision, but because the prolonged silence made everything naturally fall into distance. The important people in his life did not disappear all at once, did not leave in an easily noticeable way, but one by one, under different circumstances, no longer there in the way they once were. There were relationships that ended in misunderstanding, relationships that simply could not continue, people who went far without the chance to return. And when looking back, it was not always possible to determine exactly when everything began to change, only knowing that at some point, what had once been familiar was no longer the same. Through all of that, there were decisions that had been made that could not be changed. Not choices that were simply right or wrong, but choices that carried long-lasting consequences. Directions that once chosen had no way back. He was not someone who often stopped to wonder what would happen if he had done differently. Did not live in the assumption of possibilities that had not occurred. But that did not mean he did not realize that every decision left a mark, that what had been chosen also meant giving up other possibilities. The silence, which had always been part of the way he existed, now was not only a protective shell, but also the place hiding things that had never been spoken. There were emotions not shared, not because they did not exist, but because they were not put into words. There were thoughts not expressed, not because there was no way to say them, but because he chose not to say them. And when that stretched over many years, many decades, it created a space that no one else could step into. A place where everything still existed but was not seen. Not all the things left unspoken were clear regrets. Not every silence contained things left unfinished, but there was a quiet feeling, an awareness that did not need to be put into words, that there were things that if done differently could have led to a different result. Not better or worse, but just different. And as time passed, as the opportunities to change were no longer there, that became a part of the way he looked back at his life. Clint Eastwood was not someone who sought forgiveness from the past, nor someone who tried to repair what had happened. He continued to live, continued to work, continued to move in the direction he had chosen. But now looking back did not mean he did not feel the price of always moving forward. Each step carried a part of what had been left behind. Each success existed together with what had not been achieved. Each decision was tied to what could not be changed. There were times when there did not need to be a specific moment to realize that. No big event, no clear reminder, just a feeling that appeared when looking at what remained and what no longer was. When familiar faces no longer appeared, when relationships no longer kept their shape, when stories were no longer continued. That was not a loss spoken in words, but a change he understood clearly, even when he did not express it. And through all of that, he still kept his familiar way of reacting, not stopping, not turning back, not trying to change what had passed. But that steadfastness was not without emotion, not the indifference many still think. It was a different way of facing things, a way of accepting that not everything could be kept, that there were things that could only be carried as a part of himself, that could not be put down, could not be repaired. The price of not looking back did not lie in losing everything, but in knowing that there were things that had passed and could not return, and the choice to continue without trying to change that. Clint Eastwood did not talk about that price, did not name it, did not turn it into a story. But it existed, quietly, in the same way that most of his life had unfolded. And perhaps right in that silence, people could feel more than any explanation that behind a man who always moved forward, always kept control, always did not show emotion, was a journey where each step carried what could not be kept. And then, as the years continued to pass without stopping, Clint Eastwood stepped into a stage that most others had left long before. A stage where the stage lights usually dimmed gradually, where names that once stood at the peak became memories more than the present. But he did not disappear. He did not step back. At the age of 80, then 90, when time began to leave clear marks on his body, when each step was no longer as light as before, when the rhythm of the world around seemed faster than the reaction ability of a person who had lived through nearly a whole century, Clint Eastwood still continued working, still stood behind the camera, still made decisions, still held the position he had held for many decades. There were not many people from the same generation left there to share that space. The faces that had once appeared with him had gone through similar periods, had understood what he had been through, left one by one, each in their own way. Some withdrew, some no longer appeared, some no longer existed, and over time, that gap grew larger, not as an event happening in one moment, but as a long process, where each passing year carried another name that was no longer there. That created a feeling that not everyone could understand, not loneliness, in the usual sense, not the absence of people around, but the fact that there were no longer many people who truly shared the same experience, the same memory, the same journey. When those who had once been there were no longer there, the stories became harder to tell, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was no longer anyone to fully understand what was being said. Clint Eastwood became one of the last ones still standing in that position, not because he sought it, but because he continued while others had stopped. Age did not come like a shock, did not appear in a clear moment, but came gradually, through small, unavoidable changes. The body no longer reacted as quickly as before. Energy was no longer as abundant as in the early years. Movements became slower, heavier. Things that had once been done naturally now required more effort, more focus. But Clint Eastwood did not stop because of that. He did not deny the change, did not try to prove he was still the same as before, but continued working within the new limits his body set, adjusting, adapting, but not giving up. On the film set, his presence no longer carried the same kind of energy as in the years before, but carried a different weight, a stillness that no one could replace. He did not need to move fast, did not need to speak much, did not need to prove anything. Just him being there was enough for everything to function. The experience accumulated over many years did not disappear with age, but became clearer, sharper, as if every decision made had gone through a process that others did not see. But outside of work, the world became quieter. Not because everything around stopped, but because the number of people left to share those things grew fewer. Success was still there. Fame was still there. What he had built did not disappear. But the feeling that came with it was no longer the same as before. When a person stands at the peak for a long time, that peak is no longer a place to reach, but a place to stay. And staying there while everything around changes brings a kind of stillness that not everyone experiences. There were moments when the silence was not a choice, but the result of circumstances. There were not as many conversations as before, not as many people to call, not as many occasions to return to what had once been familiar, not because he was being separated, but because the world around him had changed in a way he could not control. And in that change, Clint Eastwood still kept his position, not trying to chase after it, not trying to adjust to fit what was newer, but continuing in the way he had lived before. That did not diminish the value of what he had achieved, but it changed the way he experienced them. Success no longer came with wide sharing, no longer reflected through relationships as before. but existed as a part of the past and present at the same time. He did not lose what he had built, but the way he lived with it became different. And through all of that, an image gradually became clearer. Not the image of a man weakening, but the image of a man still standing firm, but in a space that was becoming quieter. A person who had gone through almost the entire journey this industry could offer. A person who continued while others had stopped. A person who did not seek attention, but still did not leave his position. Clint Eastwood did not need to say that he was getting old. That showed through every movement, through the way he walked, through the way he worked. But what did not change was the way he faced all of that. No complaining, no explaining, no seeking sympathy. He continued as if stopping had never really been a choice. And in that continuation, there was something both clear and hard to name, that standing at the peak for a long time was not only an achievement, but also a state, where everything around gradually changed, while he himself stayed there, carrying everything that had passed, in a silence that no one could fully share. And then, when the silence of the years standing at the peak became clearer than ever, Clint Eastwood began to spend more time on the things that had always been behind work before. It was not a sudden change, not a declared decision, but a slow shift, almost unnoticed by anyone, where he gradually turned back to the relationships that had existed for a long time, but were not always placed at the center. His children, who had once grown up in different gaps, in periods when his presence was not complete, now became connecting points that he tried to hold on to in the way he could. Reconnecting did not happen like in the stories usually seen, with no long conversations immediately erasing the distance, with no powerful moments changing everything. It happened through smaller things, unassuming meetings, conversations that did not need to explain too much. There were times when it was just sitting together in a space, not needing to say much, but still enough to feel that the connection still existed. For Clint Eastwood, being there, even in silence, was sometimes a form of presence he could offer. He did not become a different person, did not suddenly open up in the way people expected. He remained the man of few words, still kept a certain distance, still did not easily share what was inside. But there was a small change, not in words, but in time. He spent more time with family, not as an obligation, but as a choice, even if it might be later than what others had once expected. Those periods were not always perfect, not always easy, but they existed, and that was already different from before. The moments of closeness, therefore, became rare but carried their own meaning. They were not big events, not specially planned occasions, but times of being together without the pressure to become something else. A meal, a short conversation, a presence not interrupted by work. Things that before might have been overlooked now became what was most worth holding on to, not because they were rare, but because he began to see their value in a way he had not stopped to recognize before. Trying to keep the remaining relationships was not an easy process. Not all gaps could be narrowed. Not everything from the past could be redone. There were limits that time set, parts of the past that could not be changed, and Clint Eastwood did not try to deny that. He did not try to repair everything, did not try to make everything into a perfect image. Instead, he accepted what remained and worked with it, in the way he knew. In that process, there was a realization that did not need to be put into words. That not all value lay in big things. Not all achievements were measured by what could be seen from the outside. There were smaller things, less noticed, but carrying a different weight when viewed from another angle. The meetings, the presences, the moments not recorded but still existing, those things did not replace what had been lost, but they created a form of balance that he had not sought before. Clint Eastwood did not stop his work, did not leave the path he had walked for many decades. But alongside that, he began to keep more of what belonged to his personal life, not through big changes, but through small choices repeated over time. Each time staying a little longer, each time spending a little more time, each time not letting work completely overshadow everything. Those things did not create an immediate change, but gradually they reshaped the way he lived in this stage of his life. And through all of that, there was a feeling both clear and hard to express, that time was no longer infinite as before. It was not a spoken fear, not an obvious pressure, but a quiet awareness that what remained needed to be held on to in a way he had not done before. Not because he was trying to make up for it, but because he began to understand that there were things that, once past, would never come back. The remaining relationships, therefore, were not only a part of life, but became anchors he held on to, not through dependence, but through appreciation. They did not need to be perfect, did not need to be like what others expected, just needed to exist in the way they could. And perhaps, in his familiar silence, Clint Eastwood had found something he had not sought in the years before. Not a complete change, but a different way to stay with what remained. And when what remained began to be held with more attention, with slower choices, another part of Clint Eastwood's life also gradually became clearer. Not in front of the public, not in what was spoken, but in the silences he had lived with for many years. Those were thoughts he had never shared, things that did not appear in any interviews, did not become stories to tell, but still existed, persistently, as a part inseparable from who he was. The loneliness in his life was not a sudden state, did not come from a specific event, but was a long, quiet flow that began very early and had never really stopped. It was not always clearly visible, not always taking the shape of an easily recognizable sadness, but existed as a space that was always there. Even when there were people around, work, successes that others looked at and thought were enough to fill everything. But there were gaps not created by external absence, but by things inside that were not shared, not named, not put down. There were thoughts he kept to himself, not because there was no one to tell, but because he chose not to tell. Not big secrets in the way people usually imagined, but simpler things, yet heavier. Questions without clear answers, emotions not easy to express, realizations about his own life that did not need to be turned into words. He was not someone who sought relief through sharing, not someone who needed to be understood by others to feel lighter. He carried those things, not as a clear burden, but as a part of the way he existed. When, looking back at the choices that had brought him to his current position, there was not always a simple answer to what was right or wrong. The paths chosen could not be separated from the paths left behind, and each decision carried both sides. Clint Eastwood did not live in regret in the way people usually think, did not constantly go back to the past to change what had happened. But that did not mean he was not aware that every step had its price, that what he had gained also meant what he had not kept. There were things that, if viewed from another angle, could have led to a different life. Not better or worse, but just different. But he did not try to imagine that for too long, did not let possibilities that had not occurred dominate the present. He looked at what he had lost, and accepted that they existed together, inseparable, irreplaceable for each other. That was not resignation, but a form of understanding that did not need to be put into words. Facing what could not be changed was not a big action, not a decisive moment, but a process that unfolded over time, when opportunities to do differently were no longer there. When people who had left could not return, when periods of time that had passed could not be filled, what remained was not trying to repair, but the way of living with what had become a part of himself. Clint Eastwood did not resist that, did not try to deny it, but accepted it in the way he still did with everything else in his life, without saying much, without explaining, just continuing. That acceptance did not take the shape of absolute serenity, was not a state where everything was resolved. It was a fragile balance, where what had happened no longer disturbed as before, but also did not disappear. The memories, the decisions, the relationships, all still there, but no longer demanding to be changed. They existed as parts that had shaped who he was, and accepting them also meant accepting himself. Clint Eastwood did not need to become a different person to feel complete. He did not seek a better version of himself, did not try to rewrite the story in another way. He looked at himself as he existed, with everything he had and everything he had lost, and did not try to separate them. That did not make everything easier, but it made everything clearer, in a way that did not need to be expressed. And perhaps that was what he had never spoken, not because he wanted to keep it secret, but because he did not need to say it, that life is not a story that can be fully explained. Not a journey where everything has a clear meaning, that there are parts that are never told, not because they are not important, but because they do not need to be understood in the way others expect. And in that silence, Clint Eastwood still continued to exist, not as an image the world saw, but as a person who had learned to live with everything that could not be changed, without needing to speak it, but still always there. And when everything that had passed gradually gathered in a longer, deeper look, Clint Eastwood did not stand there like a man recounting his story, did not rearrange each chapter to find a clear meaning, but simply existed among everything that had happened, as if life was not something that needed to be explained, but something that had been lived fully in the only way he knew. There was no perfect straight line connecting from the starting point to the present, no journey guided by consecutive victories, but a series of uncertain steps, choices that were not always right, moments that could not be returned to, and long silences that no one else saw. But right in all of that, there was one thing that did not change, a persistence that did not need to be proven, a way of existing that did not depend on being understood or recognized. He was not a perfect person, and perhaps had never tried to become one. There were decisions that led to loss, relationships that could not keep their original shape, periods when his presence was not enough to hold everything together. But those things did not make him stop, did not make him turn his back on the path he had chosen. Clint Eastwood did not live to repair the entire past, did not try to erase what had happened, but carried them as a part of himself, inseparable, undenied. His steadfastness did not come from never having faced difficulties, but from the way he went through them without letting them define the ending. There were pressures he did not speak about, periods when everything was not clear, times when continuing brought no guarantee, but he still continued, not with strong statements, not with attention-grabbing actions, but by simply not stopping. He did not always know where he was going. The path was not always clear, but stopping had never really been a choice he considered. There was something in the way he lived that was not easy to name, not defiance, nor complete acceptance, but a kind of balance between the two. He did not resist what had happened, but also did not let it hold him back. He did not try to escape the unfinished parts, but also did not let them prevent the next step. And in that continuous motion, an image gradually became clearer, not of a man who had won everything, but of a man who had gone through everything without falling. What he left behind was not only in the films, not only the roles audiences still remembered, not only the awards placed on the shelf, but a way of existing, a way of going through life without needing to be perfect to continue. Clint Eastwood did not become a symbol only because of what he achieved, but because of the way he kept himself throughout that journey, not changing to fit everything around him, not losing himself to gain recognition, not letting changes shape who he was in a way he did not choose. There are people remembered for brilliant moments, clear victories, easy-to-tell stories, but Clint Eastwood's story does not lie in individual bright points, but in the entire journey, where everything, both the good and the unfinished, exists together. He did not escape what had happened, did not leave behind parts of his life, but carried them as a part of the path he continued to walk. And perhaps that is exactly why his image is not a man standing at the peak looking down, but a man still walking, step by step, in silence, without needing to prove anything anymore. At an age when many had stopped long ago, Clint Eastwood was still there, not to affirm his position, but because he had never learned how to leave it. Not because he was afraid to stop, but because continuing had become something natural, like breathing, like the rhythm of steps. And in that continuation, there was no complete release, no ending point where everything became clear and light. There were things that still remained, memories, decisions, relationships that had changed, all existing together in a man the world thought they understood, but in reality did not. Clint Eastwood did not escape his life in the way people usually expect. He did not leave behind all the heavy things, did not step into a completely new chapter separate from the past, but he also was not held back by them. He continued, carrying it all, not lighter but also not stopping. And perhaps that is what defines him most clearly. Not a man who had overcome everything, but a man who had endured everything and still kept walking. And when looking at that final image, it was not a perfect ending, not a neatly closed story, but a prolonged moment, where a man was still moving forward, slower, heavier, but still keeping the same direction. There was no noise, no showiness, only the presence of a person who had gone through almost the entire journey life could offer, and still chose to continue. In silence, in the way he had always done. Looking back at Clint Eastwood's entire journey, what makes people not only admire but also feel poignant is the way a person could go through an entire life while almost never allowing himself to stop to be weak. From a childhood that did not leave clear marks, where he grew up in temporariness and the feeling that no one saw him, to the fateful night in the ocean when he nearly disappeared without anyone knowing, all of that had created a person accustomed to existing in silence. When stepping into Hollywood and being continuously rejected, he was not saved, not supported, but simply stayed in the way he had done since he was a child. Success coming from Europe with Sergio Leone did not erase the strangeness, but only made it deeper. And when Dirty Harry brought him to the peak, it also pushed him into misunderstanding and isolation. The broken relationships, the incomplete family, the children who grew up with distance, all did not create an explosive tragedy, but a long, quiet sadness. What is worth reflecting on for the American people is not how he succeeded, but the price that a society emphasizing individual achievement can force a person to pay. This story reminds that discipline and willpower can bring a person to the peak. But if there is a lack of connection and presence in close relationships, then that success is never truly complete. Clint Eastwood is not a perfect man, but it is precisely that imperfection, together with the fact that he still kept walking, that has made him a symbol not only of cinema, but also of a generation accustomed to enduring more than sharing. If the story about Clint Eastwood makes you reflect, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to show respect for a man who has silently endured throughout his entire life. Thank you for listening, and see you again in the next video, where the stories behind the spotlight have never been fully told.